Today, I thought I would talk about, this is a pretty prevalent, I don't say thought process, but I mean, it's also a mentality, I guess, where like, you'll recommend something to someone and then they're just like, oh, but they can just do this to beat it. I don't even think it's like necessarily like downplaying or like intentionally downplaying. It's that people don't really understand how like things like mental stacks and stuff like that work, right? I thought I would talk about my perspective on why these things work, or like, you know, even if you have an option that could lose, what is the relevancy of it? I guess it kind of is defeatist. It is a little defeatist. Admittedly, let's say if I run a button, they'll just do nothing and counter my approach. If I run up and wait, they'll just run up in their offense. These two examples are like probably the best. They are both the same sort of situation, but they require a different response from the opponent, right? If you do not necessarily think about it like this, you maybe think like, oh, it's just so simple to start like to counter my approach, but it's not quite as cut and dry. Okay, I do remember how to use the bullet points. I'm getting good at this every now and then. Since fighting games aren't as vocal about like, oh, like what to expect, how to beat it, whatever, a lot of people get caught in this mentality of like, oh, everything I do can lose, and I'm just like playing against the odds. There's a lot of kind of formulas for why this sort of thing can happen. Let's talk about mental stacks. Mental stacks are basically the amount of options that you can represent that your opponent has to think about, right? It's not just about like, I have like 15% meter compared to like 20% meter. Like most people are not going to think about that level of difference at a very high level, probably. Like in general, like most of the time, people are gonna be focused on what your character can do, whether it be run at you, jump, whatever. A common example of this is like a mental stack situation could be like IEDs, right? To cover IEDs, you pretty much space yourself and wait to react. Likewise, if you are already kind of doing this like leads into the defeatist mentality in and of itself. So sometimes by representing the option, you can get countered by, you know, somebody doing nothing. There is obviously the other side of it where if you just run up and wait, they'll start their own offense, right? These two things do not mix together, right? Like these two options, if I do run up button, they'll do nothing and counter my approach, implies, you know, oh, you do it on the ground, you force something, and they press the button when you approach. If you're also covering IEDs though, then you're entirely going to be just trying to react, right? This is the whole thing. If I run up and wait, this is actually the correct answer to kind of bait out reaction. Of course, they can dash up and start offense, but this is when it begins to get more into risk reward. In general, it's rare that you're gonna find someone that is this efficient. It's very, very rare. I view things very turn-based. Like I pick an option, you pick an option, sort of deal, right? That's basically how I think about general interactions in neutral or on offense, less about how you open them up and more about countering the options they choose. If you try to view it more about like all the crazy ways you can open them up, you can actually end up countering your own approach. I would not be confident enough to say this is everyone, but every character has their own flowchart of learning where it's like, you'll probably go towards these buttons, you'll probably run offense in this way, you'll probably run neutral in that way. Like these things are usually flowcharted. Not everyone falls into this category, but a lot of people do, because it's like, think of it more as people are learning their character and learning to take advantage of their strength. It's not necessarily like a bad thing, it's just like, if you're going to learn what's good about a character, you're going to use what's good about the character. Sometimes when you're learning what's good about the character, you don't have many options besides what's good, you know what I mean? Sometimes if you lean too much into the strong options, it makes the strong options weak from how predictable they are. You are probably seeing where I'm starting to go with this, right? So a very common trap that a lot of people fall into when they're learning is they usually will play characters or other people who don't really know how to fight against their character. Then they'll start playing people who are stronger, who have more of an understanding of like what strong elements they have. And then usually it leads into this, where it's like, oh, it just feels like everything is not working. Think of it like this. Think of it less along the lines of like, oh, like if I IED, they'll always 6P. Think about it more of like they're committing to an option. They've thrown down their Yu-Gi-Oh card, so to speak. They can't do anything besides wait to see what you do. This is very important about fighting games in general, but Usually, doing nothing and reacting will beat about 90% of your hit. This is not a character-specific thing. This is a fighting game specific thing. A lot of people will end up kind of getting caught up in like, I can show them all these offensive situations and like RPS here and there, but then like essentially doing nothing will just beat it. If it doesn't beat it directly, it'll beat it through risk reward, which I know we're we're a broken record with talking about risk reward, but I promise it's important. Don't close the tab. Listen to me. What would you do? Again, this is more, I guess, situated to newer players other than mid-level players, so I don't want to say just block, because that is not really good advice. If you view it from the lens of risk reward, you will almost always will end up in a positive situation. But like how I think about it, like, and how characters act and how characters function is usually like you choose an option, I choose an option. There's nothing more to it than that. There are ways you can kind of mess with it. Ultimately, it's like you're choosing an option that will beat some options and lose to others. They choose an option that will beat some, will lose to others. There is no way to cover every action. If you're fighting against someone who's just covering every action, like you approach, they hit you, you ID, they hit you, then you should consider about, well, how am I getting hit? I'm approaching, and then they just respond and react, right? So think of it like this. If we view it from that lens, correct option to beat run up button, wait, and contest, right? If I ID button, they'll just do nothing and counter my approach. Correct option to beating IED button, wait, and 6 beat. You can see in both cases, these are two different options that basically lose to the same thing, right? I've made a slight video on this about overlap in making your strategies, where like essentially you overcommit and you do too much, I guess, like force an opening, when in actuality, they have given you information on how to counter them, it's just you don't see it. If I do run up and wait, they'll just run up and start offense, right? Correct option, beating, run up, wait, run up, and preemptive button, right? This is way different from the other two options we've already discussed, right? Way different. In both cases, these two options just lose to waiting, right? Like just straight up. Whereas if you did that here, this would just create a situation where one, it would give you information at minimum, or at worst, they make you block, which, you know, in comparison to these two options, not that big of a deal. Purely from the lens of like, I just go in and it doesn't work, you should maybe consider like, oh, maybe they're just waiting and trying to counter poke me because I've shown that I'll just do this, right? Another thing about this is the flowchart of learning that I talked about, right? Some characters, like they're just close range characters, and as a result, they may feel more incentivized to just go in and gamble, right? So like in that case, you may think like, oh, like they just counter everything I do, when in actuality, it's more of a case of, oh, you're just not doing enough different stuff, right? You're not requiring them to change their game plan or strategy at all. Let's say if you've shown like, I run up button, they'll just do nothing, or I'll IAD and they just do nothing. If you do moves like, oh, I run up and wait and make them like kind of hesitate, maybe I go for whiff punishes if they try to do this, right? Like if they do a preemptive button to stop your approach, you don't go into that range where you can be hit, then you just whiff punish them, right? Or ideally you can whiff punish them. It can create kind of a mental stack situation where it's like, oh, this is we're starting to get our RPS here. If they have to be afraid of you doing that, then they're going to hesitate more on your approach, right? Which means after representing this option, run up button becomes way more effective, right? This is a very simple kind of way of forcing RPS, but this is a good example. If you do this alone, this option is quite weak, but just by implementing one option of like waiting and making them hesitate, it makes your first option stronger, right? Because this alone creates an interesting situation. A lot of people, I think, also struggle where at this point, they'll guess right every time. And the fact is, no person can guess right every time. There's probably something that either you've shown like maybe 80-20, you do run up button and then try to whiff punish the other 20% of the time, right? Maybe they fall into risk reward, right? Like maybe they're just choosing the best risk reward option for the situation every time. This is basically how you'd want to approach it and how you want to view it. Every option has some weakness. If they choose that option, there is a weakness that they're showing. It's up to you to fix that, right? It's up to you to deal with that. What if they don't adapt? This is actually a common thing I hear in response to this, and the answer is just keep doing the thing they don't adapt to. I mean, if they just don't adapt, or like maybe they do it like 10% of the time, then you take advantage of that, right? If every option is beautiful, then every choice is a mistake. Exactly. That is fighting games. You've finally gotten to the center of fighting games. that is fighting games.